Gate बंद कर देना मनी. So very good afternoon to the students of the Hyderabad. My name is Abhishek Singh, and I am the CSB. I am the faculty at the CSB Academy, currently teaching over here the internal security and also taking some miscellaneous topics of the polity. So why we are here? We are here to give you an idea about terrorism. And terrorism, because if you see, yesterday only I was telling you that India had been suffering from some of the internal security challenges dating back from 1950s, when India had seen the rise of the Northeast insurgency. 60s has been the rise of Naxalism. 70s has been the Assam turmoil. 80s has been the Punjab insurgency. 90s has been the rise of Jammu and Kashmir militancy. And 2000s has been the terrorism. In 2010, as I told you yesterday, has been the cyber security challenges. In 2020 has been the hybrid warfare. So a glimpse of what we have seen yesterday. Now we'll try to understand terrorism along with that of a militancy. Now, one thing that you should note over here is that many a times, if you've been reading the newspaper very seriously, sometimes into the newspaper you will see the word terrorism, and sometimes you will also find into the word the militancy. Now, what is the idea behind terrorism? What is the idea behind terrorism? Why they do terrorism? Who is doing the terrorism? Who is basically an external state actor and a non-state actor with respect to the terrorism? So these are the basic things. What is the ideology behind terrorism? Why they wanted to create a panic when it comes to terrorism? What has been their inspiration? So these are the questions that has to be understood. See, for that matter, when I talk about the context of terrorism, in respect of India, the terrorists in India, they are very much opposed to the idea of why India displays unity in diversity. The terrorists in India, they want to destroy the Indian unique icons and the symbols. That's why you see they repeatedly attack and do the explosion onto some of the epicenters of India, particularly Delhi. Why Delhi? Because that is a political capital of India. Bangalore, because that is an IT capital of India. Mumbai, because that is a financial capital of India. Then Ayodhya, why? Because that is a religious capital of India. So if you understand what the terrorists have been thinking, what the terrorists have been doing, they are basically destroying the icons, the symbols, and they have basically changed the epicenters from the hinterland of the Jammu and Kashmir, and they are now spreading to the pan-India, and particularly attacking the financial sectors, the epicenters, the political centers, the administrative centers, and now the religious centers of India. That's why it is important to mention about it. And also we see a terrorist attack into the Hyderabad. Okay, now let us try to understand it from the perspective of how important this has become. How important the topic of terrorism, how burning this issue is. See, before 9/11 attack onto the US Pentagon Towers or the twin towers in the US, terrorism was not seen as a concern which the global community is being threatened with. But after 9/11, the world got to realize that the terrorism is not only brings a regional instability into a country, but it is a global concern which disrupts the peace, prosperity, and development of whole of the nation. So therefore, there had been multiple rounds of a talk and negotiation on the understanding of terrorism and how it creates a panic and a concern for the global community. So very recently, in 2022, there had been one conference which was called as No Money for Terror Conference. No Money for Terror conference. Now, this conference was held in New Delhi, and into this conference, what the Honorable Prime Minister of India says, he says that we consider even a single attack is one too many. Even a single life lost is one too many. So we will not rest till terrorism is uprooted. This is what he's highlighting. He's highlighting that even a single life that is being lost due to the terrorist crimes, we are not considering it as a single life, rather as an attack onto India's unity, sovereignty, and the integrity of a nation. Okay, so at the same point of time, if we see what Dr. Jaishankar says, the Honorable Minister of External Affairs, he says that there is no good terrorism or bad terrorism. Rather, terrorism is terrorism. Why? Because of the fact that terrorism knows no geographical boundaries. There are simply no geographical boundaries of the terrorism. Therefore, only a unified, and a zero tolerance approach towards the terrorism can defeat. At the same point of time, this can also be highlighted from the fact that today terrorism is becoming a transnational crime. Okay, it is becoming what? It is becoming a transnational crime. Now, what is a transnational crime? Transnational crime. Transnational crimes are basically those crimes which do not have any specific geographical boundaries, which are not restricted to one particular region. Rather, they have been spread to multitude of the regions. That's why it is being called as a transnational crime. So today, terrorism has emerged as one of the most competitive industry, as well as it has become a transnational, serious type of a transnational crime. Okay, therefore, once again, Honorable Prime Minister, he says that the terrorism today has emerged as the most biggest and competitive industry which is disrupting the world's peace, prosperity, as well as the development. At the same point of time, because of the terrorism, what the world has been witnessing, there has been a disruption of $1 trillion. The disruption which the world has been seeing because of the terrorism, and the world has to pay a price. This $1 trillion USD, and that was back in 2019. Okay, now if you can also understand the agony of or the seriousness of the terrorism with respect to the fact that in 2008, the then National Security Advisor to the Government of India, Mr. M.K. Narayan, he says that in India, roughly 800 terrorist cells are operational. At the same point of time, in 2013, India had 608 districts, of which 205 districts have been affected by terror-related violence. Even if you see one of the reports from the South Asia Terrorism Portal, the South Asia Terrorism Portal says that India is being affected by 180 plus terrorist organizations as well as individuals which have been in operation into India within the last 30 years, starting from that of the 1990s. And they have a safe house in the Gilgit-Baltistan region. Now, there is a very important index which also highlights the matter. The index is basically the Global Terrorism Index. Now, the Global Terrorism Index, for that matter, is being released by the Institute of Economics and Peace. Now, this index says that India today ranks at 14th spot, 1-4. So as per the Global Terrorism Index, which is being released by the Institute of Economics and Peace, it says that India today is at the 14th spot, 14th most vulnerable country which has been affected by terrorism. Now, one thing that should be coming into your mind, what is the difference between terrorism and militancy? What is the difference between terrorism and militancy, and how they are different and how they are also similar to each other? See, when you talk about the similarity in both of them, in the terrorism and the Jammu and Kashmir militancy, so when you see the similarity with terrorism and militancy, both have a clear result. Both of them have one common goal. The common goal is violence. Okay, violence against state. The common goal is violence against state. This has been the common goal. They both of them are driven by right-wing ideologies. Both of them are driven by right-wing ideology. Both of them have the support from Pakistan and its agencies, support from Pakistan and ISI, its intelligence agency. So these has been some of the common features that you can find in terrorism and militancy. Okay, that is, both of them would be using some degree of violence, and that violence would be against the state. Okay, have basically both, for that matter, have are driven by right-wing ideology. Both have been supported by Pakistan and its ISI agency, and the demand for both of them is Jammu and Kashmir. Demand is Jammu and Kashmir. Okay. So if you can see over here, against state, right-wing ideology, Pakistan supported, and Jammu and Kashmir. So these have been, if you see, have been the similarity. These have been the similarity in context of terrorism and the Jammu and Kashmir militancy. Then what is the difference? What is the difference between the two? Now, difference between the terrorism on one part and militancy. Terrorism and militancy is, point number one that you should understand is degree of violence. Degree of violence. Now see, in case of terrorism, the degree of violence which has been initiated by the terrorist is very high. It's very high. The violence that they would be inciting against the state, against the people, would be very high. Whereas in the militancy, the degree of violence would be high to moderate. High to moderate. One that is basically on the context of degree of violence. In one, that is in a terrorism, that is very high. In case of a militancy, it would be in between from moderate to high. Okay. Then the second basic difference between is their area of operation. Okay. Area of operation. Now, if you see in context of terrorism, the area of operation is pan-India. The area of operation remains as pan-India. If you talk about the militancy, the area of operation is restricted to Jammu and Kashmir, UT. The Jammu and Kashmir, UT. Okay. Then another important difference that you can also find out between the two has been the enemy, whom they basically call as enemy. Now, in context of terrorist, the enemy is state, that is India, plus citizens equally. So they do not differentiate, please understand this thing very importantly, that they do not differentiate between the state and the citizens. Whereas if you see, the enemy of them is basically the state. That's why if you see, for that matter, in the Jammu and Kashmir militants, why they are able to harbor, why they are able to basically harbor in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, because they are not attacking the civilians. They have the emotional connect with the civilians. Okay. The fourth, country of origin. Country of origin. So if you see the country of origin with respect to the terrorism, it is basically the foreigners mostly. Okay, foreigners. Foreigners particularly backed by basically from Pakistan mostly. And if you see the country of origin in case of the militancy, it is basically hybrid. Hybrid in context, there are foreigners also, and there are citizens also, which are citizens particularly. And now these citizens who have been indulging into the terrorism, they are called, it is being called as home-grown militancy. Homegrown militancy. Okay. Homegrown militancy supported by OGWs. OGWs are what? They are basically the overground workers. They are what? They are overground workers. So I believe I have made you understood the difference between the terrorism and militancy. So one has been on the degree of violence, high, very high, high to moderate. Second has been the area of operation. It's pan-India versus the Jammu and Kashmir, UT. Third has been the enemy, that is the state and citizens, only the state. Fourth is the country of origin. One has been the foreigners. The terrorists are generally the foreigners and who've been supported by Pakistan, and the militants are basically a hybrid. They may be foreigners, they may be citizens. And citizens, if they indulge into the militant activities, they are known as, it's being called a homegrown militancy, and often they are aided by OGWs. OGWs are overground workers. Okay. Now, I was on to the Global Terrorism Index, which was released by Institute of Economics and Peace. So, as per the Global Terrorism Index, 2024, I said that India is a hotbed of terrorism, and today India ranks as at 14th most vulnerable country. Okay, if you also see the Global Terrorism Index 2020, one very important thing it says, no international definition. No international definition of terrorism. Now, this is very important. I'll explain you. This is a very, very important thing. No international definition of terrorism. Now it says, the Global Terrorism Index 2020 says that defining terrorism is not a straightforward methodology. Why it is not a straightforward methodology? Because of the fact that there is no internationally universally accepted definition of what constitutes terrorism or terror acts. Now, why there is no definition when we talk about the terrorism? Well, there must be a certain reason of why we have not come with a single universal definition, why the global community have not accepted of what constitutes terrorism. This is also because of the different meanings and the interpretation of understanding the terrorism. The terrorism, basically, it changes from space to space, from time to time. So, because of the different meaning and the interpretation of the word terrorism that changes both spatially and temporally, therefore, the global community has not been able to define what is terrorism. There are many reasons to it. Now, I'll tell you what has been the controversy. What has been the controversy why we are not able to define terrorism? Now, the point number one into the controversy has been the degree of violence. Okay. Point number one has been the degree of violence. Now, see, for that matter, any state across the world has to resort to violence, has to use some form of force to suppress various rebel groups. Say, for example, in India, we have the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967, as well as the Armed Force Special Powers Act 1958 and 1990s, so as to suppress some form of activities like that of the Naxalism, Northeast insurgency, terrorism, or the militancy, and even Khalistan issue. Now, why we have such an stringent laws? Even we have the MACOCA, Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act 1999. Why do we have such kind of a restrictive acts? The objective of these such restrictive act is basically to stop any violence that could have happened, into the future. So now the problem becomes with the fact that the state have to use some form of violence. Now, to what extent that violence is justifiable is a debated issue. Now, every state across the world has been using the violence. Say, for example, even the Saudi Arabia have been using some form of violence to suppress any of the anti-social elements. Even the UK has laws like that of national security law that they have to suppress any of the anti-social or anti-national activities. Similarly, India have the UAPA law. But if you see the social conditioning of the country that I mentioned, Saudi Arabia, India and US, they are all different. Because if you see the degree of freedom that have been enjoyed in case of the US would be the highest. In India, it would be the moderate. In the Saudi Arabia, the degree of freedom would be the least. Now, degree of freedom has a direct correlation with the degree of violence. Wherever there has been a more higher degree of freedom, then the degree of violence that is being used by the state onto its citizen would reduce. Please understand this. If there is more degree of freedom, then there would be a less degree of violence that can be used by the state. Similarly, so if you see, because across the world, the citizens, they enjoy different freedom. Because of the different kind of freedom, there would be different degree of violence that would be used by the state. Therefore, one single definition of the terrorism is not possible, because you cannot measure the degree of violence to say up to from 0 to 5 degree of violence used by the state is justifiable, but beyond 5 is non-justifiable, because the conditioning of the states across the world are very different. So this has been point number 1, degree of violence and its usability and the justifiability with respect to resorting to the terrorism. Okay, I'll also give you one more example to it so that you understand it. But I'll just move on to the second point. Second important point is ambiguity. Okay, ambiguity. Now, why terrorism is also not being able to define, it's because of the fact that many of the nationalist movement, guerrilla movement, independence movement, separatist movement, as well as the terrorism, there is no clear line. There is no clear line to define. You cannot exactly define that this is terrorism, this is national movement, this is guerrilla warfare, this is basically Naxalism. Why? It is very difficult to differentiate between these type of movement. Say for instance, if you can think of in this way, say the CDM, the civil disobedience movement, or the NCM, which was happening in the pre-independence era, those were a nationalist movement, but those were banned by the Britishers, because the Britishers were treating it as a movement which is basically trying to secede the Britishers. But, so therefore, any of the rebellious movement, you cannot exactly differentiate that this would be a terrorist movement, this would be a guerrilla movement, this would be a nationalist movement. This is point number 1. Point number 2 that you should also note over here has been the usage of the word. Sorry, this is point number 3. I beg your pardon. That is the usage of term. Usage of term. Okay. Now see how the terrorists have been identifying themselves. How the terrorists have been basically identifying themselves to calling themselves. Now terrorists will never call themselves as a terrorist. Please understand. They will never ever call themselves as a terrorist. Rather, terrorists basically call themselves as, rather how the terrorists identify themselves. The terrorists identify themselves as a liberator, as a protector, as a freedom fighter, as a mujahideens. Terrorists will avoid using the word terrorist for themselves. Rather, terrorists would be calling themselves as a God's servant, freedom fighter, patriots. At the same point of time, there are countries which are harboring terrorism. There are countries which are dissociating from terrorism. Say, for example, there are some notorious terrorists, and along with their chiefs, like, say, for example, Hafiz Saeed and Masood Azhar. They are well-known terrorist chief of Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. But how they are identified? India identifies them with the perspective that these are terrorists by nature. But how they've been identified in Pakistan, they are basically called as the liberator who would be liberating the Jammu and Kashmir from India and would be merging it to the Pakistan. So if you see, there is basically a difference in understanding of the word also, because an understanding of the word also, that's why this term is sometimes being called as a loaded term or a charged term. It is sometimes called as a loaded term. It is also sometimes called as a charged term. Why it is being called a loaded term or a charged term? Because of the fact that the terrorists, they are creating sympathy. They are creating sympathy, they are generating the sympathy, as well as they are doing something called as a psych wars. Psych wars basically means the psychological wars. That is, they are doing what? Are brainwashing the people. They are radicalizing the people. They are radicalizing the people. They are hiding their own real identity. That's what I said. That they are calling themselves as a freedom fighter, as a God servant, as a liberator. Okay. Another very important thing why we are not able to justify or define the term terrorism has been in the dynamism. Now, this term today is a highly dynamic. This is a dynamic term. What do I mean with a dynamic term? Today, terrorism is no longer just restricted to instilling a fear among the mind, or distorting countries' sovereignty, integrity, social security, or economic security of a country, or disrupting the whole economy as a whole. Today, terrorism has changed. It has evolved to new forms, new types. Say, for example, there is economic terrorism. Economic terrorism is basically when economic terrorism. Now, economic terrorism is when the terrorists have been pumping the FICN, that is the fake Indian currency note, into India. Okay, and this is what is called as an economic terrorism. That is when the terrorists have been pushing in the fake Indian currency notes into India, and that has been done through Pakistan via Nepal territories, because with Nepal we have open borders since 1950s. Okay, then there are different. Then you can talk right over here A. You can also write B. There is something called as a narco terrorism. Okay, narco terrorism, that is when the terrorists have been indulging into the organized crimes and supplying the drugs. Okay, supplying the drugs particularly from the Golden Crescent, as well as taking hold of the Golden Triangle. Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle. So there are evidences which have been found by the IB that in the Kashmir Valley that is suffered because of the narco terrorism. There is basically cyber terrorism. Cyber terrorism. Say for example, today there is something called as True Cyber Army. True Cyber Army, which has been created with the aid and support of the Pakistan's ISI, which is doing a cyber wars on the Indian official websites. Indian official websites. Okay, then we can have another type, is basically something called as an international terrorism. International terrorism, like say for example, one example was ISIS, which what it wanted to create. It wanted to create a caliphate system in Iraq and Syria. This was operational in Iraq and Syria. We have another type, that is basically nuclear terrorism. Okay, nuclear terrorism, like that of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, when the terrorists wanted to get hold of the nuclear facility. We have another type, say bioterrorism. We have environmental terrorism. environmental terrorism, that is when the terrorists have been encroaching and doing the deforestation, which is quite evident in the Amazon forest, when the terrorists have been cutting some of the most exotic vegetation in the Amazon as well as in the Congo basin. Okay, we can have multiple because of the dynamism. Again, it is very difficult to define the terrorism. Okay, I hope you got my point till now. What I'm saying. So I said that if I just take a context again, is there is no international definition of what constitutes terrorism and terror act. And why there is international definition? Because one has been the degree of violence, second has been the ambiguity, third has been the avoidance of the usage of the word terrorism. Rather, the use is that a loaded or a charged term. Fourth has been the dynamism. And the fifth is basically the types. Then what is the definition of terrorism? See, one thing that we understood that at international level, no definition. At international level, there is no definition. But at the national level, there is a definition. Okay, so every state would be defining terrorism in their own laws. Every state will be defining terrorism in their own local national laws. Like say for India, India defines terrorism as per UAPA 1967, and it defines rather the word terrorist act. It defines the word rather terrorist act. Okay, please remember this thing. It defines the word terrorist act. It says terrorist act is basically an act when any person does any act with an intent which is with an intent to threaten India's unity, integrity, security, economic security, sovereignty, or likely to strike a terror in the minds of the people of India or in any foreign state, that would be called as a terrorist act. Because if you see, this terrorist act is dealing with the state also, that is with India also, it is also dealing with individual also, and it is also dealing with foreign countries also. So you can see that this is a wider understanding. We have not defined terrorism, rather we have defined their activity. Their activity is basically, please listen to me this thing once again, whosoever does any act with an intent to threaten India's unity, integrity, security, economic security, sovereignty, or with an intent to strike a terror in the minds of the people or in any section in India or in foreign state would be called as a terrorist act. Because this term has been so wide in nature, this can be applied to any of the rebellious group in India. Okay, any of the rebel groups in India can be booked under the UAPA. Say for example, Naxals. Now, Naxals are doing the activities which are against it, threatening individuals and also distorting the foreign relations. So they can also be called they can be booked under the UAPA and can be called as they are doing an activity which is terrorist. Say for example, insurgents of Northeast. Okay, now the insurgents of Northeast, say for example, if they are demanding something called the Greater Nagaland. So don't you think so? Greater Nagaland is basically an action which is disrupting India's unity and integrity, as well as instilling a fear in the minds of the people, as well as disrupting the foreign relations of India with the other country. Okay, or for example, Khalistan issue. When the Khalistani rebel groups, they are again demanding a separate state and merging of India Punjab and the Pakistan Punjab, as well as so please understand this thing. This is a very wide term, very wide term, which can be used extensively. Okay, another very important thing that now we understood is there are different forms of terrorism. There are different forms of terrorism. So terrorism in itself is not defined. So if someone asks you what is terrorism in a very simple way, okay, so you will say, you can say that it is a planned, organized, systematic use of violence. So terrorism is what? It is a planned, organized, and systematic use of violence for achieving any of the political objectives, religious objectives, or the ideological objectives. Okay, political objectives, religious objectives, or ideological objectives. However, you can also say that as per second ARC, second report, okay, as per second ARC, eighth report, it says terrorism is an intentional use of violence. It is what? It is an intentional use of violence. Intentional use of violence. That intentional use of violence, it is what? It is an intentional use of violence during peacetime. During peace time, when there is a peace between the nations and one state is attacking onto another state, that can be called as a terrorism. Say, for example, India and Pakistan are at a peace today. But if the Pakistan is raising the proxies, okay, is raising the proxies in the Jammu and Kashmir region and trying to instill a fear, that would be called as an intentional use of violence during the peacetime. Or it can also be called as, if there's in the context of war. In context of war. Okay, so if there is a war which is going on between two nations, and if one country attacks onto another country, particularly the civilians or the non-combatants or the neutral army, that would also be called as a terrorism. Say, for example, during the 1965 India-Pakistan war, okay, in 1965 India-Pakistan war, if Pakistan have attacked onto Nepal, or the citizens of India who are not involved in the war, that would also go into the definition of terrorism as per the eighth report of second ARC. Okay, so I hope you have understood till now what does basically terrorism means. Okay, now I was on to the forms of terrorism, right? So please understand, terrorism has different forms. Say, for example, left-wing extremism, which is also called as a Naxalism, is a type of terrorism. Okay, it is also a terrorism. Why it is a terrorism? Because they are terrorizing the people, doing something which is against the state, against the country. Okay. Then if you see the Northeast insurgency, Northeast insurgency is also a type of terrorism. Why? Because they're doing something, they're demanding state, and they're demanding what? A division from the Indian state and forming a new independent state for themselves. Say, for example, Greater Nagalim. Okay, Greater Nagalim. Okay, or the Khalistan, or for that matter, the J&K militancy. These are the different forms of terrorism. But remember that how you really differentiate between them is basically on degree of violence. On degree of violence. This is very important that you should remember. Okay, degree of violence. Say, for example, if I'll just draw down for you. Okay, if I'll just draw down for you. So if you see into this figure, the Northeast insurgent, Naxalism, militancy, and the terrorism. So if you see very, very closely in this quadrant, that the degree of violence is basically increasing. In the Northeast, the degree of violence remains the least, and in the terrorism, the degree of violence remains the highest. So one of the very ways of you can differentiating between the terrorism with other forms has been the degree of violence. Okay, so we'll see into the next class more about the terrorism. So for today, thank you so much. You have a good day ahead, and I hope to see you at CSB IAS Academy very soon.